Hello and welcome to the first of my CPD Coffee Time sessions. I'm aiming to do these in a series, possibly, well, as many as I think we need actually. So I'm going to start with using tools from cognitive behaviour therapy with children and young people. It's my first session. These sessions are generally going to last for approximately 50 minutes to 1 hour, so they're designed primarily for very busy practitioners in a time of stress who need to access some hopefully quality CPD quite quickly. The intention really here is that you can sit down with a cup of coffee and listen to me and watch these slides as we go through them and hopefully pick up some good ideas for engaging more therapeutically with children and young people. So just to briefly introduce myself, I was formerly a teacher. I have been working as a psychologist, educational child psychologist since the year 2000. And I'm also an author, and I've written extensively for Nurture UK, my favourite charity and one which I'm very, very proud to be associated with. I've also had a long and very productive relationship with Hinton House Publishers, Sarah Miles, who is amazing and a wonderful person to work with, extremely ethical, marvellous human being. So I'm very proud of the publications that we've developed. And in this session, I'm going to make reference specifically to building positive thinking habits and the essential guide to cognitive behaviour therapy, which are both available from Hinton House and very useful, user-friendly, practical resources that anyone can pick up and use in a very safe and ethical way in their school. So the key aims for today are basically that we're going to discuss this issue of anxiety and stress in children and think about how we can make use of the cognitive model in order to support them more effectively. I'm going to go through some of the background and underlying theories and principles in terms of what actually underpins this model of cognitive behaviour therapy. We're going to be very clear and specific about highlighting the link between thoughts, feelings and behaviours and how we can explain that to children and young people, and also ways and strategies in which we can actually interrupt that cycle of negative automatic thinking, feeling and behaving. So we're going to have a go at some cognitive restructuring and think about how we can use some of the tools from CBT very therapeutically, but not as therapists. And I need to make this clear from the outset. I'm not asking people here to be therapists at all, but I do think that there is an awful lot in CBT that can be given away. These are key tools and strategies that help us to keep our heads right. And I think that all of us can benefit from learning what those are and learning how to practice and use them in our everyday lives. So I'm going to present hopefully some useful resources for use in schools and in other caring settings. So hopefully this session will be relevant to you if you are a social worker or foster carer. Even if you're a parent, hopefully I really hope that that's the case and that this reaches a broader audience. So keep calm and be resilient is actually possibly the message that we're all hearing in these current very traumatic times of this COVID pandemic. How can we do this with these buzzing minds that we have? One of the ways that I think I'm managing it personally is to make use of key tools from cognitive behaviour therapy on myself. So I'm not actually going to be presenting anything to you today that I'm not really using in my own everyday life in order to actually maintain my well-being and keep my mind from overdrive, basically. At the outset, I think it's important to just focus for a wee minute on this notion of the word stressed. I do think we have to be very, very careful when we're thinking about this. This is particularly pertinent in these times as to the overuse of this word, because very often I hear children, young people saying, I'm so stressed and I'm so stressed, when actually they are feeling a bit down, a bit worried, a bit concerned. And I think we have to be very careful when we're working with children and young people to support them in really articulating this in a more solution-focused way. Very often we're not stressed, and we are at risk, I think, at times of actually over-medicalising what are normal, everyday difficult and complex sometimes emotions that we experience. We do feel down, we do feel worried about things, but that doesn't actually really always equate to this notion of stress. So we have to be careful that we don't over medicalise what are normal responses to everyday situations, which can actually be challenging for us. And I think it is the case that, for the last 2,500 years, I would suggest, since we had the Greek philosophers talking about these issues in huge amount of depth, that, we have been able to distinguish between what I would call this normal sadness or suffering and clinical depression. Since the development of the classification system for mental illness, which I do think needs to be unpicked somewhat, the boundary has become blurred, however, and I think it's important to note, just keep in the back of your head, that manual takes into account the depression. The only context it takes into account is that of bereavement. So that's quite significant. It doesn't take anything else into account in terms of depression. So I think we need to not underestimate that or forget that fact. We know that anxiety disorders are amongst the most common mental, emotional, behavioural problems to occur in our children and young people, and the statistics are problematic, and these are statistics taken from Young Minds. We also know that in terms of anxiety, girls are affected more than boys, and the same is the case for self-harm and eating disorders, although there is an increase, obviously, in the male population in both of those particular mental health issues. And I think very often these anxiety disorders will coexist with physical health conditions as well. That goes without saying to some extent. So we do have to be very, very clear that there is an increase in these behaviours, even though we must be very cautious about over-medicalising some of the normal everyday stresses that our children and young people experience. So we all experience anxiety to some extent. And it's that general feeling of apprehension or worry. It's a normal response or reaction to stressful situations. When the red flag should go up is when this really begins to become excessive and our thoughts become irrational, not based in fact or reality. And our everyday functioning is totally debilitated. We're unable to do the things that we normally would do, get up and go to school, get out of bed in the morning, go into a social situation or attend a party or stand up in front of people and talk or speak in a classroom context in front of our peer group, etc. The feelings that an anxiety disorder generates are really quite excessive. And they include these feelings of absolute panic, fear, and really irrational discomfort in everyday situations. There are many basic strategies that we can use to support children with anxiety in school, and we know transitions and separation are frequently difficult for these children, so we can accommodate and differentiate for them in terms of providing more nurturing frameworks for them to work in smaller groups, late start or arrival at school, leaving lessons early so they avoid the sensory overload of a corridor. Recognising as well that the anxiety that a child experiences often is what causes them to forget or misinterpret instructions because they have had basically a cognitive overload, and also their working memory is impaired and their ability to process information. So it may look as though these children are being rude, and I think staff have to be very careful to understand that rudeness is not intended as defiance in any sense. It's generally to do with the fact that child is in distress, and it's a way of exhibiting that distress. I think as well what we can do is support them in terms of developing relaxation techniques and self-soothing strategies. And I'll talk a lot more about this in my second session in this series, which is going to focus primarily on anxiety and different ways in which we can help and support children to self-soothe and manage that level of anxiety that they may experience on a daily basis. We can also support children around participating in class and answering questions, etc. In terms of actually doing some one-to-one intervention work, building them up towards this step-by-step, using an anxiety hierarchy with them. We can encourage more smaller group interactions where they're with supportive peers who can nurture them and ensure that they gain that increasing level of competency in developing those relationships over time. Obviously rewards for the appropriate behaviours here in terms of actually really trying, making the effort, talking about it. And I would say that we have to be careful about that, because they have to be meaningful rewards for that child or young person. And very often there'll be much smaller steps than some of us may anticipate that need to be rewarded, almost baby steps, so that someone is actually really consciously making an effort to manage a situation and make use of the tools that they may have been given in a one-to-one or smaller group context support session. We can provide an organised, calming, nurturing and supportive environment. That's quite a big ask in some of our bigger schools, which are busier, but I do think that that's important. Nurturing and safety have to come first for children with anxiety. They cannot engage in cognitive learning, academic learning, until they feel safe and they don't feel as if they are actually in a kind of overdrive. And I think this is really, really important to remember. And also I think what's important is we need to actually get feedback from children and young people about what we're doing with them or to them in terms of interventions. I think it would make a big change sometimes. Very often we say to a child, oh, let's give you some access via a social skills group, or we'll actually engage with you therapeutically in this small CBT series of sessions, etc., etc. But I do think that we need to really make sure that there is informed consent from the child, they know what this involves, but also that on a continual basis they're feeding back to us. If it's not working, we need to change what we're doing. It's not the child's fault. If the intervention doesn't work, if that child's anxiety doesn't decrease, then we need to actually reflect very carefully on what we're doing. We need to change what we're doing. We need to listen to them and make sure that we're asking them what works for them. So ultimately, I think we need to develop school-based preventative strategies at whole school, in smaller group, whole class contexts, and on an individual level for children and young people. And I think also that these preventative strategies need to be whole school and built into the systems and the policies, led by the mental health lead in these current times, who I think also we need to actually beef up that role and ensure that that person is part of the senior management team in a school. So what do we need to be focusing on? Ensuring that children understand and know how to maintain a healthy lifestyle. They're aware of relaxation and how to engage in relaxation strategies and processes, that they can become assertive in terms of actually identifying their own needs and those of others and supportive of others. They can engage in more effective thinking, manage their time, and that they understand how to manage the study process effectively. And this is central. This should be taught from the outset when children go to school, not during just exam periods. And I'll be doing a session on exam stress later on in this series. So CBT, with the exclamation marks here, is central to this, cognitive behaviour therapy approaches. And I think that these need to permeate any kind of therapeutic approach that we undertake in our interactions with children and young people. So, what is CBT? Cognitive behaviour therapy is one approach to addressing the psychological contribution to mental health issues. And it's based on this idea, as I said earlier, that thoughts create moods and feelings which influence our behaviour and alter our physiological states. In CBT, we learn that we've all got these inherent tendencies to certain specific thoughts, schemas and core beliefs, i.e. more generalised ways of thinking about things. And these can often produce levels of unhappiness and disturbance, I think, that can be extremely uncomfortable for some of us and debilitating for a small minority. What we can do, however, is learn to spot the negative thoughts as they come up and learn how to challenge and rethink them. Key strategy of CBT. CBT is usually combined with behavioural techniques, or what we would call experiments. I quite like that. I tend to use the word experiments with children and young people as opposed to homework, because sometimes homework sounds slightly pejorative. And what these experiments do is they help the children, young people, or our clients, if you're a therapist, act on these new ideas. They are intended to disconfirm the original conclusions that we may have come to and help us to confirm alternative beliefs which are more helpful to us. So I think that's extremely important. They also can address these behavioural excesses, so the avoidance of something or our inability to problem solve in a way that is helpful to us. So in terms of central concepts here, core beliefs that we have are the first level. And this is Beck's model, his 3 levels of thinking. And core beliefs are something that all of us have, clearly. Core beliefs might be, I am a failure, life is not fair, I'm a bad person. And I think that that's something that we need to understand at the outset, is that we all have these, and many of our children, young people with anxiety will have some very negative core beliefs about themselves and the way that they are and the way that the world operates. The problem here is that many of these beliefs could produce and do produce a really negative outcome for our children, young people. They can remain in this state of extreme and continuous distress for some time. And I think also we need to understand how unconditional and absolutist these core beliefs are. I'm worthless, unlovable, I'm a failure, etc. And this can really impair the view of the self that the child has. And this is very difficult initially to get a hold of, because we are actually having to unpick something that is very deeply held for the child. Schemas are mental structures that organise the information that we have and the assumptions and rules that allow us to function, even if they don't allow us to function in the best way possible. And often these are expressed as conditional if-then statements. So I would, adopting rules for my life, it could be that I'm saying, if I am a good person, then nice things will happen to me. Everyone should approve of me. I must try to excel. If I do that, then others will like me. I need to have other people's approval, attention, or affection. And I think that this is, all about shoulds, musts, oughts, and needs. And they are very significant in terms of understanding how children are thinking and managing in the daily context that they find themselves in. Because if they have these if-then statements, we need to help them and support them to unpick those. The third central concept here is that of NATs, negative automatic thoughts, and these really are the most accessible, which is why when I'm engaging with children and young people and I'm asking teachers to do this or parents to do this, I tend to say this is where we will begin. We were not going to act as a therapist and begin to think about formulation here. This is why I'm being very clear. We will start with the negative automatic thinking that they can identify quite easily. It's something that's accessible to them. It's accessible to us. We all know that we have negative automatic thoughts on a regular daily basis. So there's a level at which we all interpret the things that happen to us in our worlds, and I think this is really one of the key aspects as well of this model. And this activity is something that I always use in my trainings when I'm doing a longer session, but I put this slide in because I think it's something, if you were using this session as part of a CPD for your school or for a group of professionals working together, you might want to have a go at this. Joe sees Alex at a party, and for the sake of argument here, Joe is a boy and Joe is a girl and Alex is a boy. Joe thinks Alex looks nice, so goes up to Joe and she tries to talk to him. Alex doesn't respond to Joe's comments. Now, you could change the gender there, which I have done obviously frequently, but the idea here is to think about why, for example, Joe may approach Alex, what she might be thinking and what she might be feeling when Alex appears ostensibly to be ignoring her. So what would she be thinking of as a result of Alex's lack of responsiveness? So I usually get people to do this at tables if they're in groups or smaller groups, 2 or 3 people discussing this at a time. And the idea here is to think about the impact on her feelings and subsequently on her behaviour. And people come up with a range of examples here and ideas, but I kind of set this in the context of a party of children, young people, who are approximately 14, 15, 16 years of age. And of course, this is quite a big ask. Joe might be very distressed. She might feel, well, that's just confirmed my view of myself, that I'm ugly, no one will want to go out with me, there's something wrong with me. Other people make the interpretation that, well, actually Alex might have very, very low self-esteem himself, might be very shy, may have decided not to respond, etc., etc. It's a lovely activity just to show the fact that we interpret things differently, but how we interpret other people's behaviours and how we think about their responses to us is significant. For example, if I walk down the road and I see a friend and I say hello and they ignore me, I can choose actually here to interpret that in many ways, but one way might be, oh dear, I must have upset that person. Oh dear, what did I do? I'll begin to catastrophize and think about this and mull over this. But the other interpretation might be, I realise my friend wasn't wearing her glasses, she can't see a thing, so actually this may be the reason why she ignored me. So it's a useful and it's a fun tongue-in-cheek activity you might want to use just to introduce this notion that we do interpret other people's behaviours very differently, sometimes in a helpful way, constructive way, and sometimes in a way that's not quite so helpful. So this initial focus on NATs, I call them negative automatic thoughts, NATs. We know that if you scratch the surface of any mood problem, almost any mood problem, such as depression, you will find the associated self-talk, negative self-talk that underpins this. And I think this is where we begin with our children and young people. It's the most accessible area in terms of actually identifying their negative automatic thoughts. And again, what actually really for me is useful to fundamentally think about it is about this background and context here. What is it that underpins this model? Eleanor Roosevelt's quote is probably the one that I think I love the most, and that is this notion that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. So it is about how we interpret other people's responses and reactions to us as human beings. Okay, thinking is what we do, and sometimes thinking and the way that we think about things is not helpful. What we think is not always a fact. So men are disturbed not by things but by the views which they take of them. And Shakespeare, I love this, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent, unless, of course, you are a child who has experienced significant trauma, developmental trauma, sexual, emotional, physical abuse. That's a very, very different thing. So we need to be very clear about that. There's a wide evidence base here and an increasing evidence base for the use of CBT, its application in a range of different disorders and problems, social anxiety, eating disorders, self-esteem, self-harm, etc. So I think we can be very, very, confident that we're actually using tools from a therapeutic approach that has a good, solid evidence base. And this includes the use of CBT applications around anxiety disorders in particular. So I think we need to remember that. And I would suggest here that maybe one of the additions at this current point in time is post-COVID stress disorder may well be something that we are beginning to understand further and think about how we actually support children, young people and adults with that particular disorder, which I think is in reality something that we're going to have to consider on an increasing level. So if you're interested in the history of CBT, I think you could look up many of these psychologists, researchers, psychologists. It's a combination of behavioural therapists, cognitive therapy. So thinking about Pavlov's dogs, okay, at the very beginning here, and then thinking about Beck's theory, which we will go through briefly. The cognitive model, sometimes we call it the hot cross bun model, is something that we need to consider too. This is what we're talking about when we're thinking about CBT in terms of it incorporating and taking into account these 5 aspects of an individual's life experience. So the way that they think, their moods and feelings, their behaviours, their physical reactions, but also the environment, the context in which they find themselves and in which they operate. So Beck's theory basically Beck's theory here begins with this notion that our early life experiences, events, relationships and attachments that we have actually then engender our core beliefs and schemas. So obviously if I am told significantly on a continual basis as a child that I'm a good person, that I'm loved and I'm nurtured and I'm supported in the right way, I'm going to believe good things about myself, and my core beliefs and schemas are going to be relatively positive. The reverse could be the case, okay? So my early life experiences might generate core beliefs and would generate core beliefs that are very negative had my early life experiences been traumatic and abusive. These conditional assumptions, beliefs and rules then trigger negative automatic thoughts. So one of my core beliefs as a child would have been that it's important to be a good person, and this was generated by a loving and nurturing father, primarily, who basically showed this huge amount of unconditional love. So then I would be thinking conditionally that if I am there for this good person, and it's important to be good and it's important to be kind, that if I was good and kind, then people would be very, very kind back to me, that I would have a good and happy life, the teachers would love me, I'd do well. The problem here is that when these conditional assumptions and these core beliefs basically become what we would call maladaptive, not helpful to me. So those beliefs were helpful at school to me on a personal level, because I was able very much to engage with my teachers. I loved school, I was good, I really worked hard, etc., etc. And I was kind, and kindness to me was really, really important, being generous. So I would actually share the sweets that I had on a daily basis with my friends. But unfortunately, that became maladaptive, because what I ended up doing was giving my friends all of my sweets, and then being told they wanted more. So I would go home and sadly steal from my mother's purse so that I could go and buy my so-called friends more sweets. And of course, what I hadn't realised was how maladaptive that had become as a child, that core belief that it was important to be good, and that if I was good, my conditional assumption would be that everything would be okay and I'd have lovely friends. In fact, that had become maladaptive because I was engaging in what Seligman calls learned helplessness, and in effect I was being bullied. But I didn't understand that, and I couldn't kind of unpick that. So I think it's really, really important to help children identify their core beliefs, and this is one of the things that I do in my sessions with young people. Those negative automatic thoughts then produce the feelings and behaviours and physiology that we're going to talk about in a wee bit more depth now. So just recapping briefly on these core beliefs, I do think it's important to remember these are very, very important because they are strong ideas and they produce rules and demands for us, and very often they're quite global and absolute. They're great if they work for us, but they're not so good when they don't, and we need to actually support children to unpick that. One word of caution around cognitive distortions here. I think what we need to be doing is supporting children to challenge ineffective thinking or negative thinking. But it's not as simple as changing a negative to a positive, okay? I think that's very, very important. And I tend to talk about ineffective, unhelpful thinking and changing it to something that's more effective and more helpful, okay? Not a negative to a positive. And a quick activity that you might want to undertake just to explain the links and to reinforce the links is to just think back to a time when you've been on your way to an important appointment or meeting, you've been stuck in a traffic jam or the train's been delayed. And this is something really, really important. It's just to get together with another colleague or friend and talk about how you felt in that situation, what you were thinking at the time, how that generated certain feelings, maybe of fear, of anxiety, what that did physiologically to your body. Were you having an increased heart rate? Did you feel hot? Did you feel sweaty? Did you become more irrational in the way in which you were driving, if you were driving? I think that's a really helpful little activity just to undertake to reinforce this link between thinking, feeling and behaving and the physiological aspects of this. And if you want to explain this, if you're going to explain it in a simple way to children and young people, you can draw out a triangle: thinking, feeling, behaving. You can use this example, or you can use an example that is pertinent to the child. I think this is quite helpful. So I'm thinking I'm rubbish at maths. So what does that generate? In me, that generates feelings of anxiety. I feel sick. I get shaky in the maths test. I get that kind of emotional hijack because my stress hormones are so increased that actually I don't engage in the test at all. I freeze totally. And what do? I fail. And what does that give me? It gives me more evidence for my original negative automatic thought, which was that I'm rubbish at maths. See, I am rubbish at maths. Look what happened to me in this test. What we have to be able to do is intercept this at that initial negative automatic thought, to support the child in being able to stop there and to begin to put strategies in place to cognitively reframe. So yes, I find maths difficult. However, I'm sitting in this exam now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my deep breathing, and I'm going to stop and I'm going to think. I'm not going to go to my traffic light green go. I'm going to stay in amber here, and I'm going to think, what are the 3 things that I need to do now? I need to actually just take a deep breath. I need to pause. I need to read through the paper first, carefully and slowly, 3 times. I then need to pick out the ones that I think I might be able to have a go at first, and then do that bit by bit. So actually it's not about just saying I'm rubbish at maths, let's change that to a cognitive reframe. I'm quite good at maths, because actually I find it really difficult. So that's inauthentic, that's not helpful to the child. So you can see it's slightly more complex than just changing a negative to a positive. We have to give them the tools to do that. So another activity for you is to have a go at actually testing your thoughts here. And I think this is something that I use with all the children and young people that I work with. And I think it's something that you might find helpful just to have a go at with a colleague. What I will do is I will say to the child, let's think about what your negative thought is, the one that you have the most frequently. And I'll write down for them on 1/2 of a piece of paper the evidence for it. They'll probably have lots of that because they've held on to this thought for a reasonable amount of time, very often quite a long time. So there'll be lots of reasons why they think that. And then I'll say, what's the evidence against it? That could be quite hard because sometimes they'll have very little. So I might have to support them with that. You know, if they think their negative automatic thought is, you know, everyone in this school hates me, I'm rubbish at everything. I might say to them, well, okay, well, wait a minute. I heard Mrs. So-and-so the other day that you worked really well in that lesson. You were helpful to someone else, etc., etc. So we'll start to begin to put some of that evidence down. Then you say to the child, what would your best friend say about this thought? And, you know, hopefully they have a best friend. If they don't, I will take that role on as the therapist, but I would take on the role of their best friend. But usually they will have a friend who, and they will say, well, my friend would say that was a bit silly because it's not quite true because. And then you ask them, what would you say to your best friend if he or she had this thought? And that generally is where the cognitive shift tends to take place, because we all like giving advice and children love it. So that, you know, if you ask them what they want to put in the behaviour policy as sanctions, they'll come up with a long list, as long as your arm, in a very quick time frame. So I think this is quite a helpful one here. What would you say to your best friend? And they'll come up with lots of advice here. You know, this is the reason why you shouldn't think this. And then I'll say to them, well, actually, you know, how true do you think this thought is now? If you're saying that to your best friend, don't you also think this is something you should be saying to yourself? So when you have that negative automatic thought, let's write this down. Let's write this down on a positive thought card. Let's reframe that and say, you know, next time you have this thought, take out that card, take out that post-it note, take out your journal and read again what you would tell your best friend and say this to yourself. So one of the activities that I would use is a distorted thinking sheet, and you will find all of the resources here in my Hinton House publications. But this is just a very simple one that you could do with children and young people. And it's about working out what kind of thinking error they are making use of. So for example, the first negative thought on this activity sheet is, it's my fault everyone can't go on the school trip. So that's over personalisation. Okay, so they are all idiots, generalization. So we're thinking about helping them, supporting them to identify what kind of negative or distorted thinking that they are engaging in. And again, this is another way of thought testing and challenging, which is what we did in the previous activity, which is providing evidence against thoughts. It's very powerful to do this. So, you know, what would your best friend say? What would other people say? What would your teacher say? And I think this is helpful to them, this framework, in terms of identifying the thought, providing a facility for them to identify what the evidence is, the evidence against it is, and also how to revise that. What do you think now? Okay, so I'm going to fail my GCSEs. I've not been concentrating this year, but I normally do okay on tests actually. And if I've always done well on them, why should this be any different? Okay, so I think I'm likely to do okay, just need to put a bit more work in. And again, this is just another simple framework, a behaviour experiment. So thinking about how to actually, we call it bash those gnats, which some people might like, other people might not like that kind of language. But for lots of the teens that I work with, this does seem to be quite helpful. So again, the thinking, the support, the challenge, what others are saying, and the revised thought is a direct result of engaging in this behaviour experiment. So sometimes I will use rating scales with children and young people. I'm going to be doing a session in this series on solution-focused brief therapy. So this will come up again and in a lot more depth. But very often we will say, you know, how did you feel at that point in time? And using a scale, a visual scale like this, is really helpful when we're asking children to go away and think about and analyse their negative automatic thoughts on a daily basis. For some, they might want to make use of something more visual, such as a thermometer rating scale. And again, this is something that's helpful with younger children. And this is a simple rating system for a teen with social anxiety. And this is about thinking about gathering evidence, gathering the facts, gathering what's really going on. So we're thinking about what was happening to you at each time during these days and rating yourself on a scale of 0 to 10 as to how anxious you felt. And then, of course, what we would do when we're talking to the child is think about what was different then, what was going on, why was it increased at that point, what lesson were you in, who were you sitting next to, what was the activity like, why were you more anxious about that? So that we can then begin to think about ways of actually ensuring that that child helps themselves, but there's also help by those who can help them to manage more effectively at those more stressful points in each of their school day. So the types of self-monitoring are usually to do with frequency counts. So how many times during the day did I feel like making myself sick or have a panic attack, etc. How long it lasted, so the duration. Self-ratings, again, this scaling notion, the thermometer notion, and keeping diaries. And we have lots of those in the resources that I'm going to recommend here. Example here of thinking about looking at when you were getting angry during the school day, what was happening, who was near you, what did you think, what did you do, what went through your mind, how long were you angry for, what did you do to try to stop yourself. And I think that's important because we want to give children and young people the sense that they can make a difference themselves. It's about empowering them and increasing their sense of autonomy, because the more autonomous we feel, the less anxious we feel, but also ensuring that other people are aware that they have a part to play in this in terms of supporting the child. And again, this is a very simple way of beginning to think about what someone is actually worried about. So when I'm nervous or panicking, this is what I'm worrying about. So thinking about these things and then exploring this in more depth with the child, and then actually challenging whether or not those worries are based in fact or reality. Reminding the child again, a feeling is not a fact, okay? And what I'm thinking in my head is not necessarily a fact. And here we've got a very simple food diary. And again, this is about getting the child or young person to think about their food behaviours, and particularly about what they were thinking when they did or didn't make themselves sick. And if they managed to hold on and managed not to do this, what it was that was really helping or supporting them in their own heads and around them in their social context. Beating the worries diary, again, when we're talking about journaling and analysing and collecting evidence and data to further think about how we are managing our worries. This is a really useful and helpful, very simple framework. And again, these are all available in my resources. Framework for supporting the child to think about when they did not actually engage in self-harm behaviours, and analysing what was going on, what was different, what was helpful. So again, this is solution focused. It's about finding exceptions and thinking about, you know, what it is that helps them to do this should increase their capacity over time to be able to decrease the level of self-harm on a regular basis. So you will find all of these tools and strategies and many, many more in this publication from Hinton House. And the reason I'm presenting it unashamedly is because I know it works, and I know that this is something that colleagues in both upper primary and lower secondary schools have been able to deliver as part of PSHE. And in fact, one of my local primary schools here used it as part of their transition programme for Year 6. So it's something that you can do with deliver to a whole class or smaller groups, or use with individual children. And one of the very simple activities here is to look at 6 thinking areas that we might engage in, and asking the children to consider which one they think they're most guilty of and what impact that has on them. And I think this might be something that you might want to do yourselves when we go to the next slide, and think about your own thinking areas and how much you engage in them, and how helpful or unhelpful they are to you. So do you do yourself down, focus only on negatives, even if something was good, overall you only see the bad bits in it? Do you blow things out of proportion? I call this catastrophizing, making them worse than they are. It's all or nothing. I only got 78% in that test, not 100. Oh God, it's not good enough, Predicting failure, again, mind reading, some of us call it, or fortune telling. So knowing I'm going to fail, doesn't matter what I do, I will fail. Well, we don't know that, we haven't got the evidence for that. Over emotional thoughts, setting yourself up, setting targets too high, and lots of people with anxiety, children in particular, do this. So making the targets far too big instead of making them smaller steps which are manageable, so that we reinforce our self-esteem rather than pull it apart. Blaming yourself, so it's all my fault if it goes wrong. It's my fault, it's because of me, I turned on the computer, it crashed, it's obviously my fault, I'm useless at this. So I think this is quite a helpful thing to engage in if you are doing this as part of a CPD session with other colleagues. Just have a think about this and discuss it. But also, this is what I would use with children and young people, and it's directly taken from the Hinton House resource. So the contents of this resource, there are 15 sessions, and again, this is really, really helpful if you want to do this safely, and you know you're not delivering a therapeutic approach here. What you're doing is you're using tools from this therapeutic approach to help children to engage in more effective thinking and manage their anxiety better on a daily basis. So this is a really useful, helpful structure. So asking them to think about how we think, how our thinking influences our feelings and behaviours, identifying negative automatic thoughts, and relating those to specific areas around self-image and our influences, and how we can beat the blues and change this cycle. So very, very useful, practical, lovely worksheets and helpful strategies to use with children and young people. And obviously, of course, it's not just about teaching how to cognitively reframe. CBT also involves behavioural experiments which produce, I think, better outcomes, in that they also are incorporating aspects of relaxation, mindfulness, activity scheduling. Lots of this I'm going to talk about in the second session, which is going to be the real focus on anxiety and self-soothing. But I think it's really important just to flag this up, and these are incorporated in any CBT approach. So my first session with a young person would look generally like this, and I think most of the SENCOs, mental health leads that I work with who engage with children and develop and deliver this kind of intervention would probably use something similar. So engaging in a bit of problem-free talk. Obviously I would get to know the child if I was working therapeutically, but obviously you will probably know the child that you're working with very well indeed. You know the children in your school, in your context. But I'm talking to them about what they want to change initially. It's got to be their list of goals. What is it they want to stop doing and get better at and feel better at in their daily lives? It's not about me imposing it. I teach them about the thoughts, feelings and behaviours triangle or cycle. I use the example of the maths test if necessary, or I ask them for their own negative automatic thought and use that. We think about what it is they think about mostly in terms of negative thinking, and we do the evidence for and against it, usually with me writing those down, and we may use the what would my friends say strategy. We scale the thought, and we try to think of a cognitive reframe based on what they might say to someone else who had that thought, who was someone that they loved, such as a good friend. And we'll set up an experiment which may involve them actually trying to use for example, their cognitive reframe on a daily basis. It may engage them in gathering more evidence as to when things are better, so that we can try and get more exceptions to this rule in their day. And then we'd set up the next session. So it's a very simple, basic framework. It's not delivering a therapeutic approach. It's using tools from therapy, using tools from CBT in order to engage more therapeutically with the young person. So finally, how do we take this forward? I think it is important that you've got time to reflect on some of these very, I say, really quite simple strategies. And I think that all of us can make use of these. I can walk down the corridor in a school and hear a teacher engaging with a young person and saying, do you know what? Do you think you're catastrophizing there? Do you think you're blowing that out of proportion a wee bit? How true is that? Do you really think that's, tell me, what's your evidence? I'm curious about that. Why do you really think that? Do you think so-and-so would say that about you? I think that those are the kinds of conversations that I want us to have increasingly with our young people. And I think all members of staff can be skilled up to actually engage like that with children and young people if they understand the key principles and the tools and strategies that we would use therapeutically in a CBT intervention. So the barriers, I suppose, you can think about these in your school. It may be that people don't feel skilled up enough. It may be that they feel they don't have enough access, or they may be feeling that, I'm not a therapist, this isn't safe for me. And this is why I've kind of re-emphasized this throughout this presentation. It's not about being a therapist, and I think we need to move away from this. As we see our children increasingly under stress during this COVID pandemic, at this particular time I'm recording this session, I think there's going to be a real need for us more than ever to be able to interact more therapeutically with ourselves, with each other, and with our children and young people. So I think overcoming some of these barriers is about us talking about this, sharing our knowledge, engaging more in terms of actually accessing CPD such as this that's helpful, practical, user-friendly, and just picking up resources that are out there. We don't need to recreate the wheel here, but that are out there that have been used, tried and tested, such as this essential guide. If you're worried that you don't know enough, and obviously I think anyone would be saying to me now, I need to actually get some more information. This essential guide is really, really helpful. Takes you through in more depth, but it's still just a wee publication. It's not a huge book, but takes you through in more depth the whole cognitive behaviour therapy approach, the underlying philosophical approaches that underpin it, and also some of the evidence base for it. But what it also does is takes you through ways in which you can use these tools with younger children, with teenagers, and with groups of children, young people in a school context and outside of a school context. So it may be that there are things that you want to investigate further, so please do make reference to this resource. Also, it might be helpful for you, just at the end of this session, if you're sharing it with colleagues, to just sit down together and think about what tools and strategies could you use today or tomorrow as a direct result of participating in this Coffee Time CPD session with me. There may be something straight away that you think, yeah, I could actually go and help a child to test out their thinking. I could support them in identifying negative automatic thoughts and in using this cognitive restructuring tool that I've presented today. So it'd be really helpful to do that, and I really hope this has been helpful. All feedback gratefully received. I don't have notes for any of these sessions. I'm just talking here from the heart. I've got the slides ready, but I'm basically just talking to you as I would do if I was standing up and presenting at a session. And it's harder, I think, in a way, because it would be lovely to see people's faces, obviously, but this is new territory for many of us in these times. And, it's the end of my first session. I just want to be very clear that it's not the end in terms of sessions. I'm going to produce as many as I possibly can over the next few months, because I think that there's never been a time when school teachers in particular have been as stressed and in need of more support. And also I know financially that schools are in straitened times. So, accessing training from professionals is difficult. The money is definitely not there. So I'm providing this via YouTube. I'm posting everything that I do from now on because I want to give the psychology away, and I want to make sure that teachers in schools, social workers, carers, professionals who work and nurture young children do have access to some really good quality CPD, and also are pointed in the direction of tools and strategies that work and resources that are evidence-based. So thank you very much for listening and participating, and hopefully I'll see you well, I won't see you, I will hopefully be able to engage with you again in the second session in this series, which will focus on anxiety. Thank you very much.